Britain after the war was economically lagging far behind other countries in Western Europe. Mass emigration and loss of life during this period had a huge impact on the economy and industry of the UK, and there was a huge labour shortage. This all coincided with the creation of the National Health Service in 1948. The government needed workers to help fill the severe post-war labour shortages and rebuild the economy, and so they passed the British Nationality Act of 1948, which allowed the use of migrant workers from Commonwealth countries to rebuild the country. The Act granted all Commonwealth citizens the right to work and live in Britain. Many of those who came became manual workers, drivers, cleaners and nurses in the newly established NHS. Windrush is the term used to refer to the generation who emigrated to Britain from different parts of Commonwealth between 1948 to 1971. It was named after the ship HMT Empire Windrush, which arrived in Essex in 1948, bringing hundreds of passengers from the Caribbean to the UK. The ship carried 1027 passengers. Of these, more than 800 passengers gave their last country of residence as somewhere in the Caribbean. And HMT Empire Windrush has become a symbol of a wider mass migration movement, and the term Windrush is often collectively used to refer to the movement of migrants into the UK around this time, including non-Caribbean countries such as India or Pakistan. Whilst those who migrated to the UK during this period were led to believe they were British and welcome, the Windrush generation arrived in a hostile environment, encountering racism, discrimination, and exploitation. Finding accommodation became difficult for many Commonwealth migrants due to growing prejudice in the 1940s and 1950s. Landlords often refused to rent to black families, and some even exploited migrants by renting them overprices, overcrowded accommodation. Racial discrimination and the shortage of affordable, decent housing meant that many migrant communities were forced to live in poor living conditions. In the 1950s, there were several instances of mobilized racist demonstrations, often accumulating in violent clashes between racist protesters and minority groups. Most notably were the riots in Nottingham and Notting Hill in 1958, but these took place all over the UK in the decades following the arrival of the Windrush. There was also a rise in the activity of fascist groups in Britain across this era, the most notable group being the National Front. The growing prejudice against Commonwealth migrants was further exacerbated by the government's anti-immigrant discourse and legislation in the decades that followed the arrival of the Windrush. On the 20th of April 1968, Tory MP Enoch Powell made the Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham. Powell denounced immigration and advocated it be reduced to negligible proportions and funds be provided for Black and Asian immigrants to be repatriated. Whilst controversial, his speech resonated with many in the far right, and this led to further demonstrations and attacks on minority groups. Powell was not the only MP to stir hatred amongst the population. Prime Minister Clement Attlee also suggested that an influx of coloured people domiciled here is likely to impair the harmony, strength, and cohesion of our public and social life, and to cause discord and unhappiness among all concerned. Labour MP Arthur Creech-Jones. Do not worry. These people are just adventurers. They will not last longer that one British winter. The government passed two Commonwealth Immigration Acts in 1962 and 1968. Both acts further restricted the rights of Commonwealth citizens to enter the UK. This meant that one's application was subject to much harsher checks. Only skilled workers would be permitted entry. The later act prevented anyone from arriving in the UK who did not already have family here. Both major political parties began to demonise immigration, and immigrants to gain electoral success, despite these people having been invited to live and work in Britain. Modern Britain has been shaped and transformed by the Windrush generation. From food to the arts, and even politics, the contribution of the Windrush generation has been immense to British culture. One notable figure is Claudia Jones, who arrived from Trinidad and became a civil rights activist, a journalist, raising awareness of the poor treatment of migrant communities. She went on to organise an event to celebrate Caribbean culture, which became known as the Notting Hill Carnival in 1966. Today, this is one of the biggest street festivals in the entire world. But perhaps the most visible impact the Windrush generation has had on Britain can be seen in their influence on music and fashion. When the Windrush generation arrived in Britain, they brought with them an explosion of jazz, reggae, ska, blues, gospel, Latin and calypso, at a time when London was all about swing and dance bands. These musical styles both enriched and transformed the British music scene. British mods quickly picked up on Jamaican ska music and natty fashions of their West Indian neighbours. In 1968, as ska had gone through rocksteady, the skinheads became synonymous with reggae. Punk morphed with reggae in two-tone, and its fans took the name Rude Boys. Punk rock and new wave music emerged from genres such as dub, ska and reggae, and the mid to late 1970s saw a ska revival in bands including the Specials and Madness. In fact, most of the punk and post-punk movements in the 1970s and 1980s were heavily influenced by Windrush culture. This has gone on to shape the music industry around the world. As music technology developed in leaps and bounds, electronic music genres emerged including dubstep, jungle, garage, grime and drum and bass. In April 2018, it emerged that the government had not properly recorded the details of people granted permission to stay in the UK, and many were wrongly mistreated. The government had also destroyed landing cards belonging to Windrush migrants in 2010. Those affected were unable to prove they were in the country legally and were prevented from accessing healthcare, work and housing. Some people lost their jobs, homes, benefits, and access to the NHS that these people helped build. In at least 83 cases, people were wrongly deported from the UK. The historical roots of the Windrush scandal concludes that the scandal was the culmination of 3 decades of racist immigration laws designed to reduce the UK's non-white population and disenfranchise black people. Whilst the government set up a scheme to compensate those who were impacted by the scandal, its existence in the first place only goes to show how deep-rooted racism is within the British state. The government invited the Windrush generation to live and work in Britain. The Windrush generation saved Britain from ruin, yet those who arrived in the 1950s and 1960s became targets of the government's xenophobia.